Fantastic. Well, I reckon we will get started because it's nice to be on time and people can come in as they need to. But welcome everybody to the quarterly LPSA Regional Working Group Open Meeting for Asia. It's nice to see many familiar names up on the screen. As always with these things, if you're in a position where you can turn your camera on, it makes for a much more engaging and personal interaction, but totally understand for some people it's all hours of the early morning or late evening, so no worries there either. For those of you who haven't met me before, my name's Peter Yates. I'm the Associate Director for Governance and the Australian Partnership Advisor at the Asia Foundation. I've previously been based with the foundation in Bangladesh and in Myanmar, and currently find myself on the west coast of Australia. So it's lovely to be speaking with you from Wujak country in WA. Tonight we've got a really nice lineup. These are generally meetings quite relatively informal. We try and bring together a couple of short presentations, discussion points, updates around what's been happening across Asia, but really an opportunity to hear from the wider group as well. So certainly welcome contributions in the chat, and when we get to discussion points, ideas and contributions from yourself as well. So please do participate as you feel happy to. I'm really glad to be one of the three co-chairs of this Asia Working Group, and it's lovely to be joined by Madhvi from OPM India, who's also a co-chair. Our other co-chair, Rachana Shrestha, who's a public management specialist at ADB, unfortunately can't join us tonight, but she's here with us in spirit and is going to watch the recording. We've also got a number of LPSA colleagues with us as well. So if you felt that there'd been a increased presence of decentralisation and local public sector expertise in the region, it's because we are joined by Jamie Boex, who's actually in Asia at the moment, which is fantastic. He's in India. So Jamie, very glad that you're not joining us at the terrible hours of the morning like you normally do. Thanks for joining us. We also have Myrna Dave, who's the Program Manager for LPSA. And it's really nice to welcome Lima Jamir, who has just started as the Working Group Coordinator for LPSA as well. So she's going to be working with us as co-chairs and active on collecting and publishing blogs for the website and so on. And so, Lima, it's really nice to have you here today. Myrna, we might just pop up the agenda if that's okay. And we'll just have a look through the plan. After the welcoming here, we're going to jump in. Fantastic to have Philip Gonzalez with us again from the Forum of Federations, who's going to give us a regional update. And then we're going to jump into a deep dive on a country that, certainly from my part in the southern part of Asia, we don't spend as much time thinking about, Mongolia. Really fantastic to have Roger Shotton joining us for that session. And then in the second part, we will get an update from both Jamie and Iqbal from the Asia Foundation in Dhaka on the state of the Logica assessments that have been going on across Asia as well too. We were going to have a technically dynamic policy priorities across the region section of the agenda, but we've hit some tech difficulties. So we'll definitely have a discussion following Jamie and Iqbal's thing where we can certainly talk about policy priorities as well, but that agenda item's changed somewhat. And then we'll just finish up with any other business that people want to raise ahead of and maybe talk about the date for the following quarterly meeting. But without further ado, thanks everyone who's joined in the last couple of minutes, and I'll pass over to Philip.
Thanks so much, Peter, and it's a great pleasure to be here with you all today to present what we'll call a regional outlook. And I won't cover all of the countries across this Indo-Pacific grouping of countries, but that I'll talk about. But I really wanted to think about Nepal, Pakistan and Philippines. So today I'll present a mixed outlook of local government, something we could think about as the good, the bad, but nothing ugly. I'll look at Nepal briefly, Pakistan and Philippines as points of reference and contrast, but also perhaps a broader reflection on the vital importance that elections can have and its relevance to providing better services, transparent and effective local government. So first off with Nepal, local governments in Nepal, after the recent elections that took place, I think a few months back, and over the last 5 years, local governments have gained far more voter trust than the country's provincial and federal governments, particularly when we consider the unstable nature of federal government, which seems to be struck in controversy, and the challenges that provincial governments have had in struggling to establish themselves. Local government in Nepal, by contrast, we see elected officials have regularly performed above average. Insiders in politics concur that local levels of government have performed better in terms of governance than their federal and have leaking roofs, and thanks to local government, markets have decentralised from district headquarters to reach interior, and dealing with issues such as roads and infrastructure have improved. So local governments are much more successful in mitigating some of those challenges, and were particularly bright lights during the pandemic, which we talked about a little bit last time. Over the past 5 years, elected mayors and ward council members have improved access to healthcare, provided citizen certificates and other important documents, government allowances, agricultural resources and information, and many other services that were previously only available from district headquarters, particularly inconvenient. So in short, Nepal is now able to contact elected authorities about any issues thanks to community access and those crucial government services. Lastly, on Nepal, according to the Auditor General's report, Nepal's local government have contributed significantly to the relief efforts for those suffering from poverty, unemployment and natural disasters. So that's a good. Let's move to perhaps a bad. Now to Pakistan. I'm not trying to put too much value judgment here, where in short, one could say the local government is not functional in a truly democratic sense. Even after elections, which, as an example, took place in KP last year. There's been little democratic impact as to public engagement and accountability. I would go as far as to suggest that there seems to be an acceptance of the status quo of this general lack of democratic accountability in the general public. So let's look at KP a little more. As indicated, local governments are not functional. There is no authority of function assigned to elected members. As a local government community, members do not even know each other. Bureaucracy is the driving force here, but it's not Belgium. And so this is a substantial issue as how to services are allocated in the issue over resource waste and corruption. This coming November, the Election Commission of Pakistan are holding general elections for both the Provincial Assembly and National Assembly. These general elections will have likely no effect on local government elections, but they do pose an opportunity to prompt provincial members to consider the virtues of effective local government and fiscal management. If we go to Sindh, there's been 2-phase elections held there at the council level, and then the mayor level. Elections were held just in June 15th of this year. In Balochistan, 2 phases again. Local government elections took place recently, first for the councillors and second for the chairman, which happened only 3 days ago. Here again, for us optimists, there is a moment that could be seized upon as elections have been held. Elected bodies are forming now. So hopefully they will be adopting a more democratic, accountable approach, as indeed is governed by the country's many local governance code. One, however, could also be pessimistic and consider that across many countries in areas like Punjab, even after general elections, there will be little chance of local government elections happening, and therefore little chance of a more democratic, transparent, inclusive local government structure. Finally, to Philippines, and more specifically to Bangsamoro, where the Bangsamoro Transition Authority is in the midst of deliberating its local governance code. This important piece of legislation is unique in that it will lend BAM's voice in an asymmetric relationship into the current unitary model that sees national government working directly with local governments and has now increased the allocation of funds that are earmarked for LGUs, local government units, through their Mandanas ruling. It's a substantial allocation of resources that will go directly to local government. However, it's an important time for Philippines in general, but it's also an important time in its capacity to deliver services in perhaps a very true decentralized fashion, though, of course, it has large centralizing tendencies, and this will take time to recede. But I think more importantly, it's historic for BARM, as it's a positive one that could mean the true autonomy, strengthening that peace process and better outcomes for its citizens. So in our estimation, much will depend on the nature of the IGR architecture and BARM's ability to be able to clarify its role in this new asymmetric dynamic. So I'll pause there, Peter. Thanks so much. That's it from me. I hope it was informative in some way. Thank you. Cheers.
Fantastic, Philip. Thank you so much. It's a great snapshot across both South and Southeast Asia. I'm keen to give anyone on the call a chance to either offer further insights or reflections on the countries that Philip mentioned, or if there are any other updates that people want to provide out for. No obligation, but it's always nice to have a chance. So particularly if anyone from any Nepal or Pakistan or Philippines who are on the call that they want to add further reflections, they're more than welcome to. Fantastic. Getting better at work, waiting for the awkward silences. So no worries. Thank you again, Philip. We'll move on. I really appreciate it. Excellent. Well, we're going to move on to the deep dive for this call, where we're going to look at Mongolia. I had the pleasure of working with Roger in Myanmar a good few years ago now, and I suspect many of you on the call have had the opportunity to engage with Roger over the years. But he's been working on decentralisation and subnational government issues across both Asia and Africa for over 30 years now, starting as a senior advisor with the United Nations Capital Development Fund, and now as a consultant for various international agencies. He's most recently been working on fiscal transfer mechanisms on local government financing, planning and budgeting arrangements in several countries in East Asia, primarily being Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia and Mongolia. In Mongolia, he's been working on for the World Bank since 2015 to support the Ministry of Finance in reforming the Local Development Fund fiscal transfer mechanism and in setting up a performance-based component and in general support for local planning and budgeting as well. So Roger, thank you so much for agreeing to come and give us a deep dive on all things Mongolia. I'll hand over to you now and I'll get your presentation up on the screen as well. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Peter. And hi, everybody. It's nice to see quite a few familiar, friendly faces on this call. So Mongolia, it's a country which is perhaps a bit off the beaten track for many of you here. It's but so a quick reminder of where it is for those of you whose geography is a bit sketchy. It's up there, squeezed between China and Russia, and of course, until 1990, Mongolia was effectively a satellite of the Soviet Union until it gained its own independence after the breakup of the Soviet Union. Tiny population, less than about a third or a quarter of many cities in South Asia, but actually over a very large land mass. It is one of the largest countries in Asia. It's a country which traditionally has lived on livestock herding, but now has increasingly, with the last 20 years, the mining sector has grown up, and so it's very much a dual economy has arisen. So basically, lots of things one could say about Mongolia. I thought I'd focus mainly on some of the issues around fiscal decentralization, which I think are perhaps maybe of some interest to participants. So if we can move on to the next slide, please, Peter. Just a quick overview of the institutional framework for subnational government. You have a setup at local level, a dual setup. So you don't have the classic local government setups you see in some countries. You have very much a dual divided setup with an elected hural sitting alongside an indirectly elected governor who oversees the executive branch, or partly oversees the executive branch, since there is many of the local line departments are under dual supervision. So you have that's the setup at the local level, and that we see there are two subnational tiers. We have the upper tier, the provincial or IMAG tier, or the tier which also the capital city Ulaanbaatar is also an entity at that level, and then below that you have the districts or the SUMs, and below then there are a number of at very local level, the choros or the bags, but they are not technically speaking subnational governments. So a two-tier structure, divided institutions, and at central level, we have, again, no classic Ministry of Local Government, and you have a rather divided setup there too. You have the Cabinet Secretariat, which oversees the governors, and then the Ministry of Finance and the sector ministries. So we have a number of challenges which come out of these divided institutions, which I'll come back to later on. I should also say that in terms of policy drives toward decentralization, we have seen a kind of pendulum swing since the time that Mongolia left the Soviet Union orbit. In the 1990s, subnational governments were given large freedom and discretion to do very much what they wanted on all fronts. Then in 2000, there was a major reversal and a fairly extreme re-centralization. But then in 2012, a return to a very gradual decentralization, but still a very gradual, piecemeal, incremental approach. There's certainly been no big bang of any sort. Next slide, please. This is just an attempt to capture visually what the subnational government structure looks like at the two levels, the two tiers, the IMAG level and the SUM level. So starting on the left, we see the elected hural, which has a sort of loose relationship of oversight with the governor's offices and various departments under the governors in blue in the middle. The governor, in turn, has a sort of loose supervision control over the deconcentrated sector departments on the right. So a lot of coordination and accountability issues arise from these institutional divisions. Of course, in the old days, when there was pre-1990, when Mongolia was effectively a one-party state, a lot of these divisions could be handled by the one-party structure. But of course, that has all now changed since 1990, 1992, the new constitution of 92, Mongolia now being a multi-party state. Next slide, please. So some quick metrics on the fiscal side. Overall, subnational, 28% of all government spending, most of which, of course, is in the Ulaanbaatar city. That puts Mongolia quite high up in the rankings of the conventional rankings of fiscal decentralization. Substantial share of revenues are also collected at subnational level. Given the surplus deficit model, which Mongolia has inherited from the old days, and which we also see in many other former Soviet socialist states, and also in Vietnam, and we see in Laos, and we used to see in Myanmar, subnational governments which are deemed to be in surplus have to remit surplus revenues back to the center. So in effect, only 16% of those revenues are retained by subnational governments, again, mostly in the capital city. The little table at the bottom captures then the surplus deficit setup, which we can perhaps come back to if people are interested to talk about it. Jamie, I know, has written about this quite a lot. So we have a few subnational governments at the two tiers mainly because they sit on buoyant revenue sources, are deemed to be in surplus and so can keep a part of their surplus revenues. The majority of subnational governments, their spending plans exceed their revenue plans and so are deemed to be in deficit. One major difference being that the surplus subnational governments are allowed a substantially greater degree of flexibility in managing their budgets, and particularly in investing their surplus revenues on the capital budget side. Next slide, please. So this is a quick overview of the functions assigned to subnational governments. I won't go into them in any detail. Fairly vague. They're set out in the budget law. They're fairly vague. A lot of repetition between the IMAG and capital city level and the SUM and district level, which actually causes, obviously, a lot of problem for the subnational governments as to knowing which level is responsible for which sorts of expenditure. On the right-hand side, a quick indication of financing sources, but I'll come to that in a moment. Until 2 years ago, the big spending sectors, health and education and health, were delegated to subnational level and were funded by special purpose transfers. That has all now been suspended as of 2 years ago for reasons which are not actually very clear. Next slide. So a quick run through the financing sources. Own revenues, of course, are a relatively modest part of the revenue sources for most subnational governments, mainly personal income and property taxes, although some subnational governments sitting on mining resources manage to get quite a lot of revenues from them. Various sorts of fiscal transfers. The deficit transfers, which of course are allocated to the subnational governments deemed to be in deficit, which are associated with many, I mean, the way the deficit transfer mechanism works has many problems and imparts a number of rather negative incentives for subnational governments, both on the revenue collection side and on the spending side. Come back to that. The local development fund transfers was something introduced 10 years ago. This, in fact, is the only formula-based grant transfer in the transfer mechanism framework, which is dedicated for small, medium investments. We have the special purpose transfers, which were there to finance the delegated health and education expenditures, now suspended. They were actually the biggest transfer until they were suspended. At the same time, in 2022, as those transfers were suspended, the government introduced, again for reasons which are not at all clear, a revenue sharing mechanism for the corporate income tax, 40% of which is shared by derivation, which actually increases quite massively the revenues to subnational level. Borrowing was possible until 2015 when for Ulaanbaatar city, but those powers were repealed at the time of the fiscal crisis in 2015 and have not been reinstated. Next slide, please. This is just a quick 5-year trend. You see the green bars were those big special purpose transfers for the delegated functions which have been suspended. You see the orange formula-based local development fund transfers. Then the twin deficit and surplus transfers. The deficit transfers in orange, which are allocated to deficit subnational governments. Then, interestingly, the negative transfers, which are the surplus transfers, those surplus revenues, which those minority of subnational governments have to revert back up to central government and actually constitute some 8% of central government revenues. So that is the pattern over the past 5 years. Now, each of these transfers comes with a number of problems and challenges, which I just want to talk to a bit on the next slide. So we'll skip the special purpose transfers, which have now been stopped, which were actually highly tied funding arrangements, which allowed no local flexibility. The surplus deficit transfer mechanism, the deficit transfers, and we, as I said, we see this in a number of the former, the countries like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Vietnam, Laos. Essentially, it's a bilateral negotiation which happens each year between the Minister of Finance and the deficit subnational government, whereby the Ministry of Finance looks at the budget proposal from the subnational government and enters into negotiation, cuts back things which it thinks are inappropriate, and agrees to finance the deficit. All of which has a number of problems. Firstly, it obviously tends to discourage subnational governments from maximizing their local fiscal effort, because the larger the deficit they can show to the Ministry of Finance, the larger the chance they have of getting a bigger deficit transfer. It also encourages wish list budgeting on the spending side and discourages any sound budget prioritization. Then also the nature of the bilateral negotiations between the Ministry of Finance and each of the subnational governments in turn effectively deprives the Ministry of Finance of an effective equalizing tool. In fact, we see that the way these transfers are allocated across subnational governments in no way corresponds to relative need. And lastly, the Minister of Finance and the sector ministries in these annual negotiations apply a series of budget norms, standard levels of approvable costs per square meter or per facility, which basically deprives the subnational governments of much local flexibility in their spending. So hence depriving subnational governments of the advantages that the centralization is supposed to impart in the first place, of local discretion, tailoring to context, etc. Maybe you want to come back and talk about that later on. So just the corporate income tax it was brought in 2022. As I say, it was rushed in. It was inserted in a revised version of the budget law, massive increase to subnational revenues, but it is unclear what the rationale for that was. Next slide, please, Peter. So let's look at this, one of the local development fund transfer, which is in a way perhaps, though it is relatively small and only accounts for some 10% of subnational revenues, has been disproportionately important because it has shown through its allocating to subnational governments a clear upfront ceiling at the beginning of the budget process, the advantages of that upfront budget constraint, and has greatly, at least on the capital side, allowed many improvements in the planning and budgeting, and also has provided incentives for local participation in the planning and budgeting processes, which are not really there for the other parts of the budget. However, this instrument, which has garnered a lot of attention in government and amongst the donors and amongst civil society, has two basic problems. Firstly, each year, government has made substantial changes to the way the local development fund has been transferred. So we see a sort of zigzag in the size of the national funding pool every year, which means that subnational governments face very unpredictable allocations each year, making their planning and budgeting that much more difficult. This has been made worse by the increasing move to funding this particular transfer entirely now from mining revenues, whereas earlier on it was funded from VAT and other funding sources as well. Now it's entirely funded from mining revenues, which of course are themselves inherently volatile. So that annual zigzag and unpredictability has been made worse. Secondly, on the equity side, part of this mechanism is actually shared. Part of the mining revenues are shared by derivation, by origin, which of course favors that 30 or 40% of local areas which enjoy mining activities in their own areas, and those areas, of course, get disproportionately much greater allocations from this transfer, with no clear rationale as to why that is so. The rationale for sharing revenues by origin has never been made clear. Secondly, the part of the allocation which is made by formula, the formula itself is replete with a number of basic algebraic problems of this, the way that the variables are weighted or not weighted. Things we actually see in a number of other countries across Asia as well, which also cause a fair amount of inequity. Anyway, I've been working for my sins with the World Bank and the Ministry of Finance the past few years on trying to attach a performance-based component to this transfer. And we have been, what we have done is develop a series of indicators, 30-some indicators, across a range of performance heads around the annual planning and budgeting cycle, and allowing performance-based grants to the better performing SUMs. This seems to have been working quite well, and we've certainly seen an improvement in the scores of the local governments, of the subnational governments over the 6-year period. The curve has been increasing, but has also been flattening the last couple of years. So there may be some limit to the future scope for improvements in performance. Now, of course, the challenges here, as in all of these mechanisms, is to try and ensure their sustainability after the end of the project. What we've been trying to do is to see if there are ways we can use the Ministry of Finance's own MIS to make assessments of subnational government performance each year, rather than do this through outsourced field surveys, which of course are relatively costly. We're not sure yet if this is going to work. Another problem, of course, is encouraging the Ministry of Finance and subnational governments at being more upfront and open with data information to the public as to the basis for the subnational government. So there's a to do. In the longer term, I mean, I think there is a question that scores are flattening off. Is there a need for such a performance-based mechanism in the longer term? These mechanisms are very popular. The Ministry of Finance loves it. Many of the politicians seem to love it, but actually, one does wonder if in the longer term, there's much value in keeping it in place. Though that's actually something which is not a very popular thing to raise in the Ministry of Finance, as I've discovered. Next slide. So a quick sort of summary of some of the strengths and the challenges in local governance in Mongolia. On the positive side, subnational governments are, for those of us who work in South Asia or other parts of Southeast Asia, you find that the subnational level in Mongolia is surprisingly well staffed and well equipped with all the IT equipment you might want. There is a very strong compliance ethos across all levels of administration. There's a fairly active civil society and strong traditions of local collective action. And so quite a strong demand on local governments to do to perform, and all of which is perhaps aided by a fair degree of social homogeneity across Mongolia. There are no significant minority groups which have to be catered for, other than the far west part of the country, where there's a significant Kazakh Muslim minority, which poses a number of challenges. But then there are some serious challenges, as I've tried to hint at in the previous slides, to the whole system. Overall, a fairly uncertain political drive to decentralize, policy making very fragmented across the various ministries, and even within the Ministry of Finance, surprisingly little dialogue between budget department, monitoring department, revenue department, fiscal policy departments. People don't seem to have the time or the space to talk to each other. I've also seen that there's a great lag, at least, in between implementing policy and legislation and then issuing practical guidance, whether in regulations or guidelines, to subnational governments. I mean, to give an example, subnational governments in Mongolia have been given by law important powers to monitor local mining companies and their activities and to protect the environment. But as of now, these powers are simply rather vague provisions in laws, but there is very little practical guidance to subnational governments as to what this might mean. And in fact, subnational governments presently do very little to fulfill their responsibilities in this area. There are presently no recognition of the specific functions and powers which urban subnational governments need to respond to the problems of what are rapidly expanding urban areas in Mongolia. There are challenges in providing services to semi-nomadic herders who move between the boundaries of subnational governments every year following their herds. We've talked about some of the issues in the dual setup at local level, which are exacerbated by widespread party political tensions. The long-standing public financial management heritage, the surplus deficit paradigms, the budget norms, the nested budgets, the old Russian doll Matryoshka nested budgets themselves cause a number of complications in the budget process, and all of which actually allow local subnational governments and the elected Khurals particularly very little role in making choices, and the Khurals find it quite hard to play their own democratic role and their own role in holding a local executive to account. And lastly, there are the long-standing tensions over the sharing of the mining revenues, which have been massively increasing the last 15, 20 years, and in managing the potential inequities which arise if local areas are given what of course they want, which is a share of the revenues generated in their areas. So quick last slide. So just a final note then, and I was just thinking a little bit about how what we see in Mongolia raises some questions around some of the more classic concepts or the pillars of fiscal decentralization that we like to talk about. I mean, in Mongolia, subnational governments do have formally devolved functions, pillar one in the classic framework. But the budget process does not allow them much discretion to spend and to tailor spending according to local context, because budgets are effectively signed off on and controlled and cut back at the center, even for those functions. The revenues, yes, substantial revenues are assigned to subnational level, but again, an important part of those revenues has to be remitted back to the center, depriving the local level of much of the incentives they might have to collect local revenues. And the transfers, the deficit transfers that we see are, again, as I've said, highly perverse and do not correspond at all to the sort of transfers that that we see in the normal literature around grant transfers in making up the vertical gaps which arise in fiscal decentralization in most countries. So I'll stop there. I've talked too much, so I'm happy to take on any questions or comments. Over.
Fantastic, Roger. Thank you for walking us through that. Really, really interesting. I want to open the floor to anyone else who might have questions or comments based on Roger's fantastic presentation. Please either just jump off mute or put your hand up, either way. Madhvi.
Maybe I'll kick us off and others can think through their questions. Roger, thanks so much. Very interesting presentation. I was curious about, on one of your slides, you had this mention about some of the functions being suspended. Could you tell us a little bit more about the reason for that and, what are the implications?
Sure, yes. So from 2012, the budget law of 2012 made clear provision for subnational governments to be given delegated functions alongside their devolved functions. And those delegated functions were primary, secondary education, primary health, social welfare, etc. And for those functions, there was an earmarked funding source, namely a series of special purpose transfers, which, as I think one of the charts shows, were the major revenue source for subnational governments. And indeed, spending on these delegated functions was about 2/3 of all subnational spending until 2022. Then revision to the budget law of 2022, whoop, they're out, they're suspended. Why? It's unclear. I couldn't get a clear picture from people I talked to in the Ministry of Finance. It seems that the view in the Ministry of Finance was that the whole, the setup for those delegated functions was so constrained that the budget norms, which the education budget norms, the health budget norms, the social welfare budget norms, were so constraining and limiting at the local level, leaving practically no local choice. I mean, there were, the costs, the book or cost of pencils or paper or books per student, the cost of heating per square meter of school were all predefined. So basically, I think people are asking, what is the point? Why, what is the point of running these funds through subnational government in the first place? Maybe we'll keep it on the central ministry budget for the time being and see if we cannot find out some better way of handling these subnational expenditures, which might perhaps in the future allow more local discretion through some more looser funding arrangements, some more looser transfers. But they're just not quite sure what that would look like, what that would mean. Part of the problem, of course, is the policy-making challenge at the center. I mean, the Ministry of Finance, there are not any obvious fora by which the Ministry of Finance can sit together with people in the Ministry of Education, Ministry of Health, Ministry of Social Welfare to work all of this out. So it's all in suspense for the moment.
Roger, that's helpful.
I have a question, Roger. First, thanks very much for the presentation. It was really fascinating to hear. I don't know much about Mongolia. What I'm interested is your observations or perspective on the dynamics in terms of technical solutions and political solutions. So you've got say bureaucrats, you've got decision makers, political and non-political decision makers, and then you've got people like yourself and the teams that you work with who are both technical experts, and you also do policy advocacy. So what I'm sort of curious about, and this is because it seems that there are some very entrenched structural impediments right now to the devolution process, which will require really complex and elaborate and structural changes technically, and also a completely different political angle probably. So I'm just curious on how you would, if you could share your observations on how the technical and the political discussions bounce around the bureaucrats and the decision makers and the technical support like you.
Thanks, Rob. I mean, you're talking about sort of technical of decentralization. Are you?
Sorry, could you repeat that? You broke up for a second.
Sorry, you're talking about technical or political discussions around issues of decentralization.
Yes, correct. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, because I'm breaking up. Well, I mean that's a good important point. I mean, in Mongolia, in the area that we love to talk about, decentralization policy, in Mongolia, it's quite hard to find interlocutors of any sort. I mean, how to address what I mean. Partly because, as I try to suggest, there's not one single perhaps there aren't in many countries, maybe there isn't in many countries such a single, I mean, there's no single obvious forum. Have a variety of ministries with interests in central local relationships.
Yeah.
Ministry of Finance as well, none of which talk to each other very much. In those ministries, of course, you have those ministries themselves are in Mongolia very politicized to a surprising degree. So after every election, of course, ministers, depending on who comes into power, not only do ministers and vice ministers change, but also senior, even mid-level bureaucrats are often changed around based on their known party affiliations, which is a further complicating factor. So that's sort of one set of issues. But another challenge, working in something like a Ministry of Finance, is I have always found it difficult, and I've been working with the World Bank, and the World Bank task managers seem to find it difficult to actually get hold of policymakers in the Ministry of Finance who are willing, who have the time or space or interest to talk about the issues that we quickly glossed over in that presentation. They're all too busy on the data administration, getting the budget ready or responding to requests for information by Parliament or whatever. So it's a very difficult environment in Mongolia I'm on the political side, of course, in the National Assembly, there was a moment of opportunity a couple of years ago when a standing committee on central local relations had been constituted, which was for a few months a forum where you could talk to politicians about this, but that's come and gone. So it's messy. I don't think I'm really responding. I'm not doing your question the justice.
It actually it's very revealing. I mean, that's what you shed light on the challenges of engagement to deal with the matters that could lead to the direction that people are talking about and want to follow them. So when you hear that, okay, the bureaucrats come and go, the politicians come and go, they're not committees established as forums to discuss certain lines of business, let's say. I mean, that does reflect how challenging it is to line up the technical and the political, because you need both in order to make change. So thank you.
Great question, Rob. Thank you. Shayla.
Yeah, hi, Roger. It's been a long time that I hope you can remember. I'm still with UNDP, and it's a long haul that we all talked about decentralization and issues which you were talking about in Mongolia. I'm disappointed. The disappointing reason is in a way in which that things have not changed much. In a way, like, we have been pursuing about this whole fiscal decentralization and decentralization in its true sense, but nothing much. So one of the participants just mentioned, and I think that perhaps to shed more light, that in the end, when it comes to decentralization, a lot of political will comes into play. And when things get changed, after any election, whether it is partisan and non-partisan, as you have mentioned, that in the case of Bangladesh, it was one of the problem that, it was non-partisan. Now, as you may know, that it's more elections are happening partisan. But the whole, I would say I am at the regional hub in UNDP. And for the time being, I'm looking into this local governance and some of the country offices, especially like Maldives and others, and they are, focusing on this whole issue of fiscal decentralization and to find out that what could be the best entry points. And in response, and definitely that's the last stage and very difficult state to get into this fiscal decentralization. So how would you really, from your experience, that these countries can really, if they would like to promote or advocate for fiscal decentralization, what could be one or two, very difficult, I know, but they could promote or make a pitch to the government just to talk about that, the benefits, of course, is there, but how they can make some policy influence with along with UNDP and other stakeholders. Over. Sorry for this long spiel. Over to you.
Hi, Shaila. Yeah, indeed. Lovely to see you too after so many years. I'm also actually normally in Bangkok, so maybe we can catch up there sometime. Look, you pose such a big question. I would rather you direct that to Jamie, or who can talk much more authoritatively than I can about advocacy for greater degrees of fiscal decentralization in the region. I'm not sure I would know where to begin. But the only thing I would say is, I feel much more comfortable talking about not in grand, look at much more unbundling that concept like that and looking at specific issues, specific services, specific functions, specific forms of financing, looking at the appropriate balance in relationship, in arrangements between the center and the local government level, because that's what it always boils down to. I mean, it's never a question of, a unilateral push to have everything be done locally. I mean, the question is always one of balance, what is best done centrally, what is best done locally, and then look at specifics as you answer those questions. I'm sure Jamie can offer something much more profound and to the point than I can on that.
Thank you, Roger. Thank you. I'm looking forward, but we'll definitely touch base since you're in Bangkok too. I've shared my number. Let's get in touch. Thanks.
Lovely, thank you. Well, I'm just aware of time, so I want to keep the agenda moving on. So let's jump on to our next item, which is with Jamie and Iqbal. So learning from the emergent evidence that's come out of the Logicare assessments that have now been done across quite a few countries in Asia, and what it says about the state of local governance. So Jamie, over to you, and then Iqbal.
There, hopefully I am now audible and you can see my screen both at the same time. Is that right?
Yes, if you want to presentation mode, yeah.
Even better if I go into presentation mode. There we go. Technology is moving forward faster than myself sometimes. There we go. Great. What I wanted to do, and I'll be brief because Peter said time is not our friend. And thanks, Roger, for such a great presentation. And I have many more things to thank you for, including my very first introduction to Asia. I'm not going to say how many decades ago because that date both of us. As many of you know, LPSA is engaged in a look at the state of local governance institutions across Asia. And we're doing this in other global regions as well. And even though it's silly, I want to begin with the rationale, and that is that the global challenges that countries face in the 21st century cannot be dealt with by any single government level alone. The challenges, whether it's access to basic public services, such as, Roger gave a great example of Mongolia, of education and health. If the central government manages this all through the central budget, is it really going to be able to give the same level of public services as if perhaps they would bow a little bit more to a more devolved or otherwise decentralized system? Or job opportunities. Can that truly be pursued by central government alone? Or issues of urban crowding, urban congestion, climate change, pandemic management, all the way to political polarization and the risk of autocracy and authoritarianism. All of these issues have a strong intergovernmental dimension, to the point there, I think it is fair to say, inclusive and effective multi-level governance systems are needed to ensure that stakeholders at all levels of not only government, but of all levels of society can work together to collectively solve these challenges. I think that's a super important kind of backdrop to any conversation on decentralization, localization, and the empowerment of subnational governments. Now, to what degree are local governments or local governance institutions empowered to address these issues? And I think Mongolia, the presentation that Roger just gave, raised some of these very issues already. How empowerment truly are elected officials in Mongolia to address some of these concerns if their citizens come to them with questions about local climate action. Can they make a decision themselves, or do they have to work with central government to get things done? And one of the things we sometimes overlook is that local empowerment fundamentally depends on the nature of subnational governance institutions. Again, in the previous presentation, Roger already touched on kind of the Matryoshka model, the dual subordination of local officials. If I'm a local health officer, I report to the governor, but I also report up to the ministry. And obviously that makes me less responsive to local priorities if my promotion depends on serving the national ministry well. So basic questions such as, not only is there a local deliberative body and a local elected body, but does that body have authority and autonomy? Is it a corporate entity? Now, many laws say by declaration of law, they'll say local governments are a corporate entity, but are they really? Does that entity have control over its own officers, right? Do they appoint their own officers? Does a municipality appoint its own secretary, or does the ministry send a secretary? Very different animals if one is the case versus the other. Does the local government approve and manage its own budget? On paper, many countries say yes, but as the Matryoshka model of Mongolia says, if that budget then gets forwarded to national parliament and renegotiated and approved, is that really the case? Likewise, does a local governance institution have it and control its own staff? I did not make up this list of kind of conditions that a local government should have, other than the last one. Actually, the IMF uses these as indicators of whether or not a local governance entity is truly a local government or not. So there is, since 1986, a series of kind of litmus test conditions that local entities should have, which would allow them to be responsive to their constituents in doing things. What we have done as LPSA is basically package that into a number of classifications of local government, ranging from effectively not very empowered to highly empowered based on these conditions. And we've started applying that to a number of countries in Asia, as well as in Africa. The first few of those are ready. Bangladesh, Indonesia, and Timor-Leste have been completed. It's a process that was started by LPSA. The Asia Foundation in a number of countries has played an important role, as has OPM. Nick Travis and the NYU Capstone team and others who have supported this process are there. I noted that Sandon Mims is on the call, who is one of the NYU Capstone team students who traveled long and far to document, and hopefully Iqbal in a moment will speak a little bit about the Bangladesh experience as well. In the interest of time, I will be very brief about the tentative findings, but if what you can see from the slide already, if the size of the bar indicates the degree of empowerment, what we find in the tentative results is that there's only one country so far we've come across where local governments meet the definition of devolved local governments that the IMF has, and with some modification that LPSA has adopted. What we see is a lot of cases, such as Roger already suggested, where maybe there is a local governance institution, but the elected leaders are not really in charge of it for one reason or another. Whether the executives are appointed, the staff is managed through a deconcentrated mechanism. In many cases, we find hybrid, deconcentrated, devolved mechanisms, or purely deconcentrated systems. The other thing we've tentatively found is that if we look at frontline services, which should be delivered and controlled typically at the local level or some local level, that in fact, that's not the case, that a lot of very localized functions, running a local health center, running a elementary or a primary school, doing small local works are often done at the central or regional level. Out of a list of 50 functions, if we ask who really performs these functions, not just what the law says, but what staff is really involved, who employs the teacher, who employs the frontline health worker, what we find is that in all but 2 cases, Indonesia and Vietnam, the vast majority is actually employed by the central or regional level. And keen observers would have noticed that Vietnam in the previous slide was not listed as one of the countries that had true devolution. And Roger also mentioned they have a similar system to Mongolia where there is a lot of dual subordination. And so even though a lot of functions in Vietnam may or may not be local, they're not locally controlled. So very high level, very tentative conclusions. Number one is institutionally, in most countries in Asia, what we find is that local governance institutions, both de jure, but especially de facto, fail to meet basic definitional requirements of devolved local governments. So we observe local governance institutions, but they don't meet the strict definitions of a true local government. Then secondly, what we find is that functional assignments in de facto terms are often still with the central or regional level and not truly decentralized or assigned to the local level. But we do find, maybe on a bit of a positive note, a degree of variation among countries. There are differences among countries within the region. In particular, Indonesia appears to have effectively devolved subnational government with extensive autonomy and authority. The Philippines, I think, does too. We will find out as we proceed with the country examples. But there is variation, and it's good to understand that variation. Now, one thing we need to be clear is we're not necessarily advocating for devolution for the purpose of devolution itself. But what I think countries should be asking themselves, and maybe this goes to the point that Shaila raised earlier, is how can we engage countries to ask the question, does the state of your local governance institutions, once we hold up a mirror to every country, does this accomplish the ambitions of the public sector in terms of achieving inclusive governance, resilient, sustainable, efficient, and equitable development? I'm not sure if that answers the question Shaila raised, because it's a bigger one. How do you convince countries to go one road or another? But I do think it's fair to point out that there are advantages to greater decentralization or different types of decentralization that may or may not be met simply by doing what Mongolia did, for instance. I could come up with a number of reasons fairly quickly why you would lose probably a lot of information about how functions are funded and transferred, even though there was very limited or no local control. But that, as Rob's question pointed out, that requires a lot of conversation and engagement, and the people may not be there to have that conversation and engagement in all places. What we do, I mean, basic questions I think for countries to ask is, if we find that these local governance institutions are de facto not empowered, then what about the effectiveness, inclusiveness, responsiveness of local public service delivery, particularly in sectors such as education, health, and water? And I think informally or anecdotally, I think there's a lot of evidence that health and water in particular would be backsliding or are backsliding in countries that don't have effective local governance institutions. In urban areas, if you don't have local governance institutions that have authority and autonomy, then how can cities be champions of urban development and deal with urban issues such as crowding and congestion and housing and local climate action? I mean, local climate action, I think worldwide is a big thing. We want cities to be involved, but why do we involve them if they don't really have meaningful powers? I think it's a question that we should be asking ourselves. If local governments, and particularly again, urban local governments, lack authority and autonomy over functional powers, then what incentive do they have to collect more own source revenue? A lot of ministries of finance and development partners are very keen for local governments to raise more revenue, but if the politics is malaligned, as again the example of Mongolia shows, what's the incentive for me to get reelected? Why would I not just get more transfer rather than more own source revenue? Another question, similar question again is, and again, Roger pointed it out, we can have elections, but if there is no clear empowerment of the elected officials over the local governance institution, what about local democracy and inclusive governance? So lots of great questions already out of a preliminary assessment where we looked, I believe, at roughly half of countries in Asia. What is coming up in the next year? Hopefully, we're performing some refinements on the methodology to make it easier to use based on the 22-23 experiences. We will have to complete some quality assurance reviews for this initial group of countries, intergovernmental profiles that was prepared. So that's coming up in the next month or two. After that, we hope to complete the rollout of the Logika framework to all countries in Asia, potentially using cross-country teams rather than one country at a time. That is something I think to discuss together with the co-chairs of the Asia Working Group. We also hopefully will be able to identify additional financial support for this process so that we can have a comprehensive data set across Asia. And then very importantly, I think, how do we take the lessons forward? How do we use this to engage? And again, that maybe goes to the question raised by Shaila and kindly forwarded to me by Roger. Although I don't know, I have an answer, so I'm throwing it back to the group. How do we take forward these lessons if we're collectively know that decentralization, localization is incomplete? What is it? How can we best inform the country level policy debates to see where progress is possible in a way that that allows the public sector to be inclusive and responsive and pursue sustainable development? Let me leave it at that, and hopefully Iqbal and maybe Sandon might be able to add something about their experiences. Thank you.
Very much, Jamie. I'll pass over to Iqbal.
Thank you, Jamie and Peter. If you think about the subnational governance in Bangladesh, in the subnational level, we are seeing two types of local elected representative and government officials. They are actually functional. And divisional level, district level, and sub-district level, we have government officials, and we have 5 tiers of local government institutions. But at this moment, actually, local government elected representatives, they are actually dependent on the government officials in everything, every decision or every service. They are playing a role at this moment. That government officials, they have the service, they are the delivery man for that services. And in the urban side, city corporation and municipalities, they are in a very good, in a better shape in terms of rural local government institutions like district council, sub-district councils, and the union portion. These 3 lower level, rural level local government institutions, they are working with the government officials. Like district councils, they are working with the deputy commissioners of the district, and the union porishad chairman and Upazila porishad chairman, they are compromising with the government officials, though they have individual laws for every tier of the local government, but that is not the practice. That law is not applying at this moment in the field. And another thing is happened for Bangladesh. Actually, before local government institutions, anyone can participate in the election. So those elections, actually, we saw that those are more participatory election, and everybody is participating in that election. But nowadays, law has changed, and now political parties, they nominate the candidate. And because of our national political situation at this moment, we are in a one party state, we can say. So at this moment, if you see the local government institutions, they are actually from most of the position, like the city corporation, Upazila Parishad chairman, union parishad chairman. With those positions also, very few were going to get like independent candidate, but most of the candidates are from ruling party. So at this moment, government officials and the local government institutions, they are working together, but not seeing the law or something like that. They are not care about the law, but practice is little bit different. So when we are ready with the result, with the logical framework result, then there is a huge scope in Bangladesh. We can work with the policymakers, we can work with the decision makers with the result, like how we can improve ourselves. Maybe we cannot improve a lot, but something we can start. And this is the election year. So if we can pursue this result to translate this to their political manifesto, so this year would be the best year to utilize this report in Bangladesh context. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Iqbal. Sandon, did you want to contribute anything? Certainly wanted to give you an opportunity if you wanted to.
Hi, thank you. I am sitting here in New York drinking my first cup of coffee and have not prepared anything to say, but I think that both Jamie and Iqbal have done a great job.
Fantastic, thank you. We'll let you enjoy your first coffee of the day for sure, Sandon. I'm keen to open it up if anyone's got any questions for Jamie or Iqbal, or just more broadly on the Logica work that's been going on. Please feel free to jump on, unmute yourself or put your hand up. Yes, Shayla.
Yeah, it's to Mr. Iqbal. Yeah, you mentioned about, the upcoming election, and, do you see, I mean, this is a question to you, because we could see that, we have seen the evolution, that it was non-partisan election, and that there was huge debate because it was, in the end, the situation was same, whether it was partisan or non-partisan. We could see that who's pro and who's not pro. Now, of course, for the past couple of years, we are doing this election, which is partisan. Now, another one is coming, your national election, and then I'm sure the local government election will follow. But when it comes to the devolution or the deconcentration, that what we have in Bangladesh, I guess, more decentralization than deconcentration. But how do you think that champions of local governance or local government in Bangladesh, soon after the election, that you plan to really about time to talk about decentralization, or you think that it's okay? I mean, it doesn't matter whether it is the decentralization in true terms that would include your fiscal decentralization, but what it would be important that services, public service delivery is reached to the people, and that would be like, complacent. But what exactly for Bangladesh you think that would make a difference, or the next mile that the champions would like to promote or influence to the government? Because what you have said, do you think any further kind of, I would say, how would I put it? Not a paradigm shift, but a quantum leap that would require for Bangladesh keeping the SDG or the agenda, this Agenda 2030, keeping that in mind. Over to you, Mr. Iqbal.
Personally, I am not seeing that lots of change going to happen in next 2 or 3 or 5 years. I'm not sure that lots of change going to happen, but the situation is really bad. Like before 20 years, there is a better system in the local government system. That was better system. But nowadays, like there is a debate, non-political, political, there is no difference. But nowadays, what is happening, like when I am getting nomination, after getting the nomination, I am start celebrating like I'm winning that position or something like that. So the political situation is really bad, and local government actually, like what I said, like already 20 years ago, it's better local government institutions we had, but nowadays we don't have that kind of environment, and we are dealing with much more critical issues at this moment in Bangladesh. So I'm not seeing any kind of changes. This is my personal opinion that I don't see any kind of big changes will happen in terms of Bangladeshi subnational level government.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Questions or comments? Okay.
Hello?
Yes, Jerome, how are you?
Yes. Hi, how are you, Peter? Yes.
Yeah, really well, thank you. Go for it.
I thought I'd just interject a very quick question. It's been quite a while since I worked on local government in Bangladesh, but at that time there was a lot of, Iqbal, just wanted to get your view. There was a lot of focus on Upazila Parishads being recently changed over to elected status. And the project I was involved in tried to empower them, as well as the union parishads, the local elected councils at the lowest level, to engage in monitoring and reporting function of the deconcentrated public services. So the public services that would have been delivered at the Upazila level by the various line ministries, there is in the local government law the right for both union parishads through their standing committees, as well as the Upazila parishads, both elected bodies, to comment on how those services are being delivered and to point out any failings, deficiencies in the delivery to the responsible concentrated line ministry officer, and that we had hoped put some pressure on the line ministry involved to improve the services. And this is primarily absenteeism in health services and educational services, these very familiar things that I see Jamie nodding about. So I wonder, is that anything that you could comment on, and is that function, that monitoring reporting function, still ongoing, and are different local government levels responsive to it? And this, I know, may depend on the MP. We had some very heavy-handed MPs that we dealt with in certain areas, and they did not like any interference in their constituency. But other ones were quite open to it, so we were able to make some headway. So thanks for any views you have on that. Thank you.
Yeah, the standing committees, they are working in the union parishad level and subnational level also. They are working, and their work is their work is depend on some kind of donor agencies project. If there is a project, they are actually the committees they can run themselves in a very good way. And what we have seen during the COVID period, the service delivery, that portion also blocked during the COVID period. During that time, local government representatives actually couldn't do anything. All the service delivery happened actually with the help of the government officials, not involve the local government representatives, because some corruption cases on that time found some kind of corruption cases. Because of that, during the COVID period and after the COVID period, there is nothing actually from the elected representatives to perform over there. What they are performing at this moment, the support they are getting from the government officials like the union, Upazila Nirbhahi officer and other ministries, whatever the support they are getting, they are implementing those in the in the grassroots level or their respective areas at this moment.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you, Iqbal. Any final questions? Otherwise, I think we'll look to wrap up. I think the only other business I had was two things. One, we'll hold our next quarterly meeting on October the 10th at the same time of day. So whatever time you've hit this meeting, we'll hold it at the same time. And secondly, just a reminder to check out the fantastic website, decentralization.net, if you haven't had a chance to recently. There's always excellent resources and pieces up there as well. Jamie, am I missing anything else before we wrap up for today?
I don't think so, but maybe from my end, just a question that if you join next time, if we have time and opportunity to give feedback on this bigger question, and it was raised by Roger and by Shaila earlier, and the conversation on Bangladesh pursued along the same lines, is if we are now documenting that, I think across global regions, Asia is, with some exceptions, not as decentralized perhaps, and not as devolved and as it perhaps thinks it is, then what implications does that have? So those questions of how do you, what can we do with that knowledge in terms of potentially engaging more effectively, both on the technical level and the political economy level, with that information? Because there seems to be, how do I put this politely, some whitewashing of the fact that, you know, engage with mayors because they're mayors and therefore they're powerful and they can change things. And if that is true in London and New York, that's great. But if that's not true in Dhaka, or if that's not true in UB or any other places in the region, we need to be a little bit honest about ourselves. So how do we engage? Do we engage? What is the mechanism by which we can get the attention of policymakers? The G20 is coming to India. The U20 is going to be highlighting, the urban government's view. Are the mayors going to be outspoken enough to say that maybe there's something that we need to pay attention to more? What is the mechanism that we can use this knowledge that we're gaining collectively by identifying these shortcomings to constructively engage as a community of practice, which involves not only mayors, not only central government officials, not only researchers, but really everyone that understands that local decisions, if local decisions are made locally under the right circumstances, they can result in more inclusive and sustainable development. So, I mean, it wasn't my question. I'm just reiterating it at the end. I think that is the crux of how do we engage with policymakers across the board with the knowledge that we are gaining and the analysis we're doing. Thank you.
Great challenge to wrap up, Jamie, and definitely a consideration. And maybe we put it front and center on the agenda for our next call as well. So we can chat about that maybe with Rachna as well. Okay, well, thank you from wherever you've joined us from at whatever time of day. Thank you very much for your contribution. Special thank you to everyone who contributed today. So Philip, Roger, Jamie, Iqbal, and all the fantastic questions as well. Much appreciated. Go well for the rest of your day, and we'll catch you on the next call. All the best.
Everyone, thanks, Peter.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Hi, everybody.
Bye-bye.